For 15 years, Margaret Walker believed her son David was lost forever, a tragic casualty of fate. But in the quiet shadows of her home, someone has been watching, a figure who seems to know too much about her past. When an old toy and a weathered photograph mysteriously appear, Margaret begins to question everything she thought she knew about loss and memory. Who is the stranger lingering on the edge of her property, and what secret have the years been hiding? The Watcher at the Window is a gripping tale of heartbreak, revelation, and the unbreakable bonds of family. Discover a truth Margaret never imagined possible. Hi guys, I'm Caitlin, and this is the Stories of Echoes channel where I tell my stories, and I hope you enjoy every second of the story. Margaret Walker stood at her kitchen window, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of chamomile tea. The autumn rain pelted against the glass, creating a somber symphony that matched her melancholy mood. As she gazed out into the gloomy evening, a flicker of movement caught her eye. There, beneath the old oak tree at the edge of her property, stood a shadowy figure. Her heart skipped a beat. The silhouette was unmistakably male, tall and lean. For a moment, Margaret's mind conjured an impossible image. Her son, David, as he might look now, 15 years after the accident that tore their family apart. She blinked, and the figure melted into the shadows, leaving her to wonder if it had been a trick of the fading light. The next morning, as Margaret tended to her small garden, her neighbor Helen Thompson bustled over, concern etched on her face. "Margaret, dear, I heard some strange noises last night. Are you all right?" Margaret hesitated, unsure whether to share her sighting. "I'm fine, Helen. Just the storm, I suppose." Helen's brow furrowed. "Well, there's been talk in town about a stranger lurking about. You really ought to be more careful, especially living alone like this." As Helen prattled on about community gossip, Margaret's mind drifted to the past. The scent of damp earth triggered a vivid memory. David, barely 10 years old, helping her plant tulip bulbs on a crisp autumn day. Thomas, her late husband, had been taking photos, his laughter mingling with the rustle of fallen leaves. The memory shattered as Helen's voice cut through. "Margaret? Are you listening?" I said. "Maybe it's time you considered moving closer to town." Margaret forced a smile. "Thank you for your concern, Helen. I'll think about it." As Helen departed, Margaret noticed something peculiar on her porch, a small, worn toy car. It was identical to the one David had cherished as a child. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, a mixture of hope and fear coursing through her veins. That afternoon, Margaret sat in Dr. Chen's office, the toy car clutched in her hand like a talisman. The therapist's gentle voice probed, "You seem distracted today, Margaret. Has something happened?" Margaret took a deep breath. I think I saw someone watching my house last night, and then this morning I found this." She held out the toy car. Dr. Chen leaned forward, her interest piqued. "And what does this object mean to you?" "It was David's favorite toy," Margaret whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But that's impossible. He's been gone for 15 years. Dr. Chen's expression softened. "Margaret, we've talked about how grief can sometimes manifest in unexpected ways, but I'm curious, how did finding this object make you feel?" Margaret paused, considering. "Terrified," she admitted, "but also hopeful. Is that crazy?" "Not at all, Doctor." Chen reassured her. "It's natural to have conflicting emotions, especially when confronted with reminders of loss. But let's explore why you might be feeling hopeful." As Margaret left the session, she felt both lighter and more unsettled. The possibility that David might be alive, might be near, was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. That evening, As storm clouds gathered on the horizon, Margaret found herself drawn to the window once more. The wind had picked up, whipping the branches of the old oak tree into a frenzy. As lightning illuminated the yard, she caught another glimpse of the figure, closer this time. Her heart pounding, Margaret moved to the front door. There, slipped partly underneath, was a weathered photograph. With shaking hands, she retrieved it. The image showed her and David on his 8th birthday, both beaming at the camera. Thomas had taken the picture just months before the accident that would change everything. Tears blurred Margaret's vision as she clutched the photo to her chest. A loud crack of thunder made her jump, and she realized the storm was now in full force. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Margaret froze, her mind racing. Could it be? But when she opened the door, it was Sergeant Mike Carter standing on her porch, rain dripping from his uniform. "Evening, Mrs. Walker. Sorry to bother you so late, but we've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Margaret hesitated, the photograph burning a hole in her pocket. She thought of the shadowy figure, the toy car, the mounting evidence that her long-lost son might have returned. But fear and uncertainty held her tongue. "Of course, Sergeant," she said, stepping aside to let him in, "though I'm not sure how much help I can be." As Sergeant Carter began his questioning, Margaret's gaze drifted to the window. Through the rain-streaked glass, she could just make out a figure standing at the edge of her property, watching, waiting. The storm raged on, mirroring the tumult in Margaret's heart. She knew that soon, very soon, she would have to confront the watcher, and with him, the painful past and the uncertain future that awaited them both. The storm raged outside, rain lashing against the windows of Margaret Walker's home. Lightning illuminated the silhouette of a figure standing in the yard, no longer trying to hide. Margaret's heart raced as she stepped onto the porch, her intuition screaming what her mind refused to believe. "David," her voice trembled, barely audible above the howling wind. The figure stepped forward, emerging from the shadows. Despite the years etched on his face, Margaret recognized her son instantly. David's eyes, so like his father's, met hers with a mixture of fear and longing. "Mom," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. For a moment they stood frozen, separated by more than just the rain-soaked yard. 15 years of absence hung between them, heavy with unspoken words and buried pain. Margaret's legs moved of their own accord, carrying her down the porch steps. She stopped just short of David, her hand reaching out, but not quite touching him, as if afraid he might disappear. "Why now?" she asked, her words carried away by the wind. "Why did you stay away so long?" David's shoulders sagged under the weight of her question. "I couldn't face you," he admitted, rain mingling with the tears on his face. "After what happened, after Dad." The mention of Thomas Walker brought a fresh wave of grief to Margaret's heart. The accident that had torn their family apart played vividly in her mind. The screeching tires, the shattering glass, David's anguished cry. "It wasn't your fault," Margaret said firmly, finally bridging the gap between them and grasping David's trembling hands. "It was never your fault." David shook his head, unable to accept her absolution. "I was driving. I should have seen the truck. If I had just—" "Stop," Margaret interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "We can't change the past, David. But you're here now. You've been watching over me, haven't you?" A flicker of surprise crossed David's face. "How did you know?" Margaret managed a small smile. "A mother always knows. The childhood toys, the photograph. I felt your presence." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Helen Thompson, Margaret's well-meaning neighbor, appeared at the edge of the yard, umbrella in hand, and concern etched on her face. "Margaret, is everything all right? I saw you out here in the storm," and Helen's words trailed off as she recognized David. Her eyes widened in disbelief. Margaret turned to Helen, still holding on to David's hand. "Helen, this is my son. David's come home." Helen's presence seemed to break the spell of isolation that had surrounded mother and son. She approached cautiously, her initial shock giving way to a tentative smile. "David Walker," she said, shaking her head in wonder. The whole town thought, "Well, it doesn't matter now. Welcome home, young man." David nodded, overwhelmed by the unexpected welcome. "Thank you, ma'am." Margaret, suddenly aware of the cold rain soaking them all, gestured towards the house. "Let's get inside. We have a lot to talk about." The warmth of the kitchen enveloped them as they entered, the familiar surroundings a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil of the past few minutes. Margaret busied herself making tea, her hands shaking slightly as she set out 3 mugs. Helen, ever the voice of the community, broke the silence. "I'll need to let Sergeant Carter know about this. He's been asking questions about the stranger in town." David tensed visibly at the mention of the police. Margaret placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "It's all right. Mike Carter, he was your father's friend. He'll understand." As the night wore on, the storm outside began to subside. Inside, mother and son began the delicate process of rebuilding their relationship, filling in the gaps of 15 years apart. Helen listened, offering quiet support and occasionally wiping away a tear. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having washed away the remnants of autumn. Margaret sat in Dr. Chen's office, David beside her as they navigated the complex emotions of their reunion. Dr. Chen listened intently, her calm presence a balm to their raw nerves. "What you're feeling is normal," she assured them. "Reconciliation takes time and patience. You've both carried this pain for so long." David nodded, his voice low as he spoke. "I've wanted to come home for years, but I was afraid of facing the past, of disrupting Mom's life." Margaret reached for his hand. "Your absence was the disruption, David. Having you here, even with all the pain we need to work through, that's healing." As they left Dr. Chen's office, they found Sergeant Carter waiting outside. His weathered face softened as he saw David. "Welcome back, son," he said, extending his hand. "Your father would be proud of you for coming home." The days that followed were a delicate dance of rediscovery. The town buzzed with the news of David's return, some welcoming, others wary. Helen took it upon herself to smooth the way, her acceptance paving the path for others to follow. 1 week after the stormy night of their reunion, Margaret and David sat on the porch, watching the sun rise over their small town. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, but there was warmth in the shared silence between them. "I made your favorite," Margaret said softly. "Blueberry pancakes, just like when you were little." David's smile was tinged with both joy and sadness. "I've missed that, missed you." As they stood to go inside for their first real shared meal in 15 years, Margaret paused, looking at her son with eyes full of love and hope. "Welcome home, David," she whispered. "Welcome home." If you enjoyed this heartfelt story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. We bring you a new story every day, and your support means the world to us. Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know what you think. See you in the next story. Stay inspired and take care.